Hello, everyone. Thank you for logging on to watch another presentation in New Farm's virtual learning series. I'm Chris Bowley, Customer and Brand Marketing Manager for New Farm. Today we'll be covering the topic of burndown herbicides and pre-plant intervals. And I'm pleased to pass you over to Dr. Dan Beran.
Thanks, Chris. Again, my name is Dan Beran. I'm the Director of Tech Service for New Farm in the U.S. And today we're going to be talking about burndown herbicides and pre-plant intervals. As we all know, when spring season rolls and planters and sprayers are out, we've got to kind of track, hey, what products do we have in the burndown applications, and what are the appropriate pre-plant intervals. So the topic that we'll hit on today, we'll just kind of dive in to get awareness on the pre-plant intervals that our herbicides are labeled for, and just provide some reminders on, hey, when you're choosing certain herbicides, keep in mind the cropping flexibility and intervals that come along with that. So our spring burndown portfolio, really a broad spectrum. We'll hit on some of these chemistries here today around 2,4-D, dicamba, some of the mixture products like Weedmaster, Burnmaster, and Spitfire. You know, for the folks out west, we have Scorch, which is a dicamba 2,4-D fluroxapyr, really our driver in kochia burndown as well. And then we also have Panther SC, Panther Pro, our Panther family of herbicides built around flumioxazin that provide burndown as well as residual and have some good flexibility and a lot of cropping scenarios that can be used, especially around Panther. So we'll hit on a little bit of that as well. So I'm going to kind of go through this based on active ingredient. And obviously there's charts and all of these things come directly from the label, but sometimes I find it handy when I'm having conversations with our team or with customers to walk through, hey, how do these things all compare when we're looking at the wide range of products that are available in the burndown window. So let's start off with a couple of 2,4-D formulations. Weedar 64, which is an amine water-soluble formulation, and Weedone LV4, an ester formulation. And the way I've got this chart built is I pulled out corn, soybeans, and wheat. And those are our three columns. And we'll look at a couple of different rates for these and compare our pre-plant intervals. And one thing you'll notice right away when you start to compare the ester formulation of Weedone versus Weedar is that you start to notice longer pre-plant intervals, especially for soybeans. And so that's the reason why, because our ester formulations have less water solubility and are less likely to wash down into the root zone, that the ester formulations just tend to be much more preferred from a burndown scenario. And again, you'll see, you know, typically we're talking a 7-day pre-plant on a pint of LV4 Weedone ahead of soybeans, and then that also would typically carry a 7-day ahead of corn as well. And then obviously if your rate jumps up, you're going to double that. And when you compare it to an amine formulation of Weedar 64 on soybeans, you go from 15 to 30 as opposed to a 7 to 15 from a 1 to 2 pint rate. So obviously in that pre-plant window, if you're ahead of soybeans, stick with the esters in most situations. Next couple of products we'll jump down to here are our 2,4-D and dicamba mixes. And actually we'll hit on all three of these: the Weedmaster, Burnmaster, and Spitfire. Some unique offerings here. You know, Weedmaster, big product used in fall applications, some early spring burndown. It's the go-to product for us in pasture and rangeland. It's an amine formulation, but it does carry pre-plant application uses on the label as well for corn, soybeans, and wheat. And when you start working with the dicamba-based products, what you'll start to notice is the dicamba really drives the pre-plant intervals, especially on soybeans. You'll see language as well for cotton. But again, when it comes to any dicamba-based formulations ahead of soybeans, it's really restricted to areas in the eastern soybean belt, areas with greater than 25 inches of rainfall. So if you look at a pint of Weedmaster, it's going to be a 7 to 15 day window for corn or soybeans. Use it a pint. Now we jump down to Burnmaster. Here we've got the ester formulation, which certainly is going to help on the 2,4-D, but again, it has the dicamba in it, and so the dicamba drives that 15-day pre-plant interval. The other thing you'll notice too, as you start looking at dicamba labels ahead of broadleaf crops, it's going to, the window for your pre-plant interval starts after rainfall or irrigation to really activate the dicamba, and then that also activates some of the degradation. So again, with these pre-plant intervals, the window starts once the rainfall occurs ahead of soybeans. So keep that in mind. So obviously, you know, the dicamba-based premixes haven't traditionally been used very much ahead of corn and soybeans, again, because those higher loads of dicamba, and that requires, you know, some restrictions there, as we're talking about, you know, 15 days at a minimum plus the rainfall. Now, with that in mind, we started looking at if there was a way we could bring some of the value of dicamba into this burn down window and address some of the issues. Because really, as you look at some of the key broadleaf weeds that are targeted in burn down, one of them is obviously mare's tail. And in a lot of geographies, you know, that typical pint of LV4 used 7 days ahead of soybean planting wasn't necessarily cutting it, especially on mare's tail that overwintered. And so we started looking at Spitfire here a number of years ago, and it's just had excellent performance on mare's tail. And the way we addressed that pre-plant, you know, maybe lack of flexibility with most of our other dicamba formulations is we pulled the dicamba back to a 0.5 pound per gallon, and we're still working with the 2,4-D ester. And so you'll notice that we have the opportunity at a 1 to 1.25 pint rate to have a 7-day pre-plant interval for soybeans. Now, it still carries that geographic restriction. That's in the higher moisture areas. And then it also carries a rainfall activation of a 1/2 inch to start that 7-day window. But certainly that's one that's become more popular, particularly in eastern no-till soybean areas where we know we've got a lot of difficult to control mare's tail. And again, that's one of those weeds, if you don't get it during burn down, you can really have a lot of issues in crops. So Spitfire is one that we've really built with kind of this pre-plant interval in mind. Now, as we move out west, Fluroxapyr, our Comet, has some really valuable use, especially when we think about kochia. Now, as kochia has come east and soybeans have gone west, a lot of times we will get questions like, hey, what about using some Comet pre-plant to soybeans? But this is one of those where there's a 120-day restriction ahead of soybeans. That's based more on residues and tolerances as opposed to safety. But again, the label is what it is. And so Comet or any Fluroxapyr-based products ahead of soybeans falls into that all other crop category. So you're going to have a 120-day pre-plant restriction. So it's a much better option ahead of corn or in a wheat rotation system if targeting kochia. So if you got kochia and you're going after a burn down product, you're probably going to be leaning more on Spitfire Burnmaster sort of application with a soybean application or with a soybean planting intended. I put down a couple of ALS products here as well. Victory, Tribenuron, or Treaty, Thiophene-sulfuron. Those are ones that we tend to maybe forget a little bit because of, you know, a lot of the driver weeds have become resistant to ALS herbicides. However, things like chickweed, henbit, shepherd's purse, a lot of those winter annuals are still very sensitive to the ALS herbicides, and especially something like Treaty carries a 0-day because of lack of residual, but it's a nice burn down ALS and can certainly round out a weed-owned credit sort of application, especially if you have some winter annuals that you need to clean up ahead of planting as well. So ones to keep in mind there around some specific weed issues. Now, when we get to all other crops, you know, obviously it's not just corn and soybeans and wheat that tend to drive a lot of the questions that we get. You get into areas with more diverse cropping situations. That's generally where a lot of the questions come up. For 2,4-D, generally at a 1 to 2 pint rate. Once you go beyond corn, soybeans, wheat, we fall into this all other crops category. So basically, after 29 days, you can go to other crops, the ones that don't have a specific section that's going to drive that. Now, when it comes to dicamba, the diglycolamine formulations in Clash, what you'll notice is all non-labeled crops, you fall into a 120-day pre-plant interval, and that would be for any use rate of less than 24 ounces. And so if you start looking, especially I get out west of the Mississippi, I'll get questions sometimes, what's the pre-plant interval ahead of small grains? If guys are doing maybe some late summer burn down or things like that ahead of winter wheat planting, or maybe even some kochia burn down ahead of a spring seeded cereal. West of the Mississippi, you're looking at a 22-day interval per 8-ounce rate. So, the dicamba labels, specifically the diglycolamines like our Clash, really walk you through, hey, what's your use rate, what's your crop, and it'll really dial you into what your pre-plant interval. So that's really helpful. It's kind of in there. If you review labels, you can get lost, but that's kind of the takeaway. Remember that 22 days per 8 ounces on small grains west of the Mississippi. I mentioned fluroxapyr, our Comet product. Once you get into all other crops, you're stuck with that 120-day restriction. So again, good flexibility ahead of wheat and corn, but certainly you fall into that 4-month window for all others. I mentioned a couple of the other SU herbicides, are tribenuron Victory or thiophansulfuron Treaty. Nice burn down products, but when you start to jump into some other crops, you're going to look at a 45-day window. If there's something that we know is more sensitive, like canola and sugar beets, it'll extend it even further, like 60 days to canola and sugar beets. So again, some of the details in here, this is all just pulled from the labels, but when you put that all ahead of you, you can kind of say, okay, this is my geography, this is our cropping rotation, the types of things that to be thinking about. If it's a wet spring and cropping intentions change, it's just good to have this quick review in my mind as to what some of the pre-plant intervals are, especially if you start to jump from maybe what your original cropping intention was. The other thing I would point out is that all of the universities, most of your major land grant universities, have their weed control herbicide guides. I like the North Dakota State ones. There's the Purdue one's really good as well. Just pick your local geography, and a lot of times those are helpful guides too, where you can maybe jump across different products and formulations and take a look at maybe some crops that you may not typically deal with and what the pre-plant intervals are. But again, all this is just generated from the label, and there's plenty of resources out there to guide your decision. Now, one of our products, maybe outside of some of the traditional growth regulator herbicides that are used in pre-plant burn down, is Panther SC, flumioxazin, our liquid formulation. And this one has a really flexible label and a lot of pre-plant uses in fall or spring burn down. And so I just wanted to call that out. There's a specific section in the Panther SC label that basically one column right here will have your rate, and then you can jump across to your crop and go, okay, I'm in corn no-till at 2 ounces. I've got a 7-day. Now there's highlights here and footnotes. Some of these, the clock needs to start with rainfall. And then in some of them as well, you're going to need to jump to a specific crop section, especially small grains and wheat. There's a specific section for certain states that drive, like no-till wheat recommendations have shorter rotational intervals than what are just listed here in the chart. So again, the nice thing about Panther SC is it's got really specific fall and spring burn down recommendations, and then it'll dial in what your use rates are and what the subsequent pre-plant interval are. And so a lot of flexibility, but when you jump into a label, I know it can be a little bit overwhelming. So again, Panther SC is one that has a lot of flexibility and utility in pre-plant intervals, and the rates and timings are really well spelled out in the label. One other piece, we're talking primarily about intervals, but I do think one of the things that is really nice about Panther and this PPO chemistry, in many cases it's being used for residual effects, but when you're using something like Panther, one of the things that is important to remember are those tank mix additives. The adjuvants can help you out and bring in dual activities. So say for instance, you're getting close to planting, maybe in a soybean situation. Obviously with Panther, you're going to have, no pre-plant restriction, but if you want to maximize burn down, knowing that you're going to be planting quickly, these PPO herbicides, flumioxazin, as well as others, really benefit from the addition of a methylated seed oil and ammonium sulfate. Those additives can make a big difference. And so I pulled some slides here from Brian Jenks in North Dakota, where he was working with 3 different PPO herbicides. And here's cyfluflanicil or Sharpen, Kixor chemistry there. That's on kochia without the adjuvants and with. And you see a very similar response. Here's sulfentrazone, you would know it as Authority, Spartan as well, with and without that AMS and MSO, and then flumioxazin again. So this would be, Panther without AMS and MSO, and then add that in there. And so when you're using chemistry like Panther for residual, if you just, take that added step of using the burn down adjuvants, you can get that added effect, which certainly can be important in a tight window when you're going to be planting relatively quickly. So again, just to review, this whole area of pre-plant interval, it can be a bit dry, sometimes a label exercise, but we do know when we get into tight windows like we've had here recently, burn down applications as well as plantings sometimes really shift into high gear very quickly once the conditions become suitable. And I think we'll be looking at that here in 2020 for a lot of geographies. And so that can certainly create, some really importance on keeping in mind what the pre-plant intervals are. Obviously, when cropping intentions shift with delayed planting, it's good to remember, okay, with these particular herbicides we're using, we may have some questions around intervals if we do change cropping intentions. So again, it's just something to keep in mind with the busyness of spring upon us. The other thing to remember too is when we're looking at different formulations, those esters carry ahead of soybeans shorter intervals than the amine 2,4-Ds are. And then if you bring in a product like an active ingredient like a fluroxapyr, great for kochia, can be used ahead of corn and wheat. But if you would be shifting to a broadleaf crop, it's going to carry a much longer pre-plant interval. And then as far as our approach to the burn down market, and this topic of intervals, we specifically built the Spitfire formulation to address the needs of tighter windows in the spring, thinking about key weeds like mare's tail and no-till soybean. We've got the weed-owned brands that bring in that ester tried and true formulation of 2,4-D, and then our Panther family of herbicides as well. It has not only the well-established residual effects, but when you pair it with other herbicides or with the right adjuvants, you can really ramp up your burn down efficacy as well. So again, thank you for joining us here today on this quick discussion on pre-plant intervals and our burn down portfolio. And as always, if you have questions for us on any of these topics, feel free to reach out to any of your New Farm reps or myself in tech service. So I'll throw it back to you, Chris.
Thank you, Dan. And thanks to everyone who took the time to watch the webinar. If you'd like additional information about the topics or products highlighted today, please visit our website at newfarm.com/US